All right, so welcome to the second video for our respiration chapter or our respiratory system chapter. So far in the first video, we went over kind of all of the structures that are part of the respiratory system. So the upper respiratory tract, the lower respiratory tract. And we mentioned external and internal respiration. So where the exchanges of gases or the exchange of gases in the body occurs. Now we're going to specifically look at how this happens and where this happens in this video. Okay, so we're going to kind of focus mostly on the gas exchange portion here, so that internal and external respiration. Now, whenever we went over the upper respiratory system, or I'm sorry, when we went over to the lower respiratory tract, we talked about the structures alveoli. And we defined what they were, but we haven't really shown too good of an image of the alveoli or really kind of looked at them in detail. So that's kind of what we're going to do beginning in this video. So like we mentioned, the alveoli are tiny filled air sacs that are at the end of the bronchioles. And these alveoli are, they come in contact with the pulmonary capillaries. And so a bed of capillaries that are in contact with the alveoli that allow the gas exchange from the alveoli into the blood and from the blood into the alveoli. And this diffusion happens pretty efficiently because the alveoli are only composed of one cell layer. So one squamosous epithelial cell layer. So remember we said that, this is really important. This type of cell is really important for diffusion, this tissue layer. Now, we also talked about how surface area to volume ratio is really important for diffusion. And the surface area of alveoli is about 800 square feet, which is pretty large amount of surface area. That square footage is half of the square footage of my old 4-bedroom house that we lived in a couple years ago. And so that's a substantial amount of surface area for gases to, move across that cellular surface. Now, the alveoli also secrete this lipoprotein surfactant, and that gives the surface tension to the alveoli to help keep them inflated, because you want them to be inflated. If they deflate, if they collapse, then that means that you're not getting air and oxygen from those alveoli, and that could be a really big problem. Now, premature infants who haven't had a chance to develop appropriately, so premature meaning that they're born early, means that they didn't have time in the womb to sufficiently develop all of their organs and body parts, etc., depending on how early they are. And so some premature infants can be born early enough to where they lack that surfactant, and they experience what's known as respiratory distress syndrome. And then the way we would treat this is just to treat them with surfactant therapy so that their lungs, the alveoli, are inflated and working as efficiently as possible. Now, like I mentioned, those alveoli are surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. And so those pulmonary capillaries are bringing the blood into direct contact with the alveoli tissue, which allows for the exchange of gases at the alveoli capillary interface. And so the lungs will receive deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle of the heart, right? And those come from the pulmonary arteries. And then the pulmonary capillaries will bring that blood into close contact with the alveoli. And then the alveoli will exchange gases with the blood, and then the venules and veins will collect the oxygenated blood from the alveolar capillaries and then bring it back to the heart, and it enters through the left side of the heart, so it can then undergo or be pushed to the systemic circulatory system. Now this image is showing kind of a zoomed in version of the alveoli, the bronchiole, and the pulmonary capillaries. So these clusters here are the alveoli. And you can see the bed of capillaries that surround them. You have the artery bringing deoxygenated blood to the alveoli, and then the vein collecting the oxygenated blood as it leaves the alveoli. Now, if we zoomed into this box and looked at that interface, which is what we're looking at here, right? You can see, again, the blood flow coming in, right? Coming in contact with the alveoli, and then flowing back to the heart. Now, if we zoom in kind of at the cellular or the tissue level of the alveoli, this is the image we're looking at now, this upper image. But what you can see is the capillary is running adjacent to that alveoli. And because there is a oxygen, or not oxygen, because there is a gas gradient, a partial pressure gradient, oxygen wants to diffuse into the capillary, and carbon dioxide wants to diffuse out. They're following their gradient. Okay, so this is a passive movement of gases. And then that allows the blood to be filled with oxygen, and then the blood to release the carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide will undergo exhalation. And so remember, this process is external respiration. Okay? Now, the way that air is brought into and out of the lungs is based off of a pressure gradient. Okay? Now, objects, gases, water, not really objects, but water, gases will move from high to low pressure. Right? So if you've ever had a water hose and you were kind of letting it with the water run out, and then you cover the end of the water hose with your thumb, you're decreasing the diameter, and so you're increasing the pressure. So the water will flow out very fast, and the air around the water hose exit has a low pressure, and so that water is going to flow to that low pressure area. Okay. And so the process of breathing kind of follows that same idea. So air will flow from high to low pressure. Okay. And so the inspiration and expiration, so air coming in and air moving out, is based off of that pressure gradient. So when your lungs are relaxed, so when you're not inhaling or exhaling, so that intermediate stage, your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles are relaxed. So remember, the diaphragm sits in between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, right under the lungs. And the intercostal muscles are the muscles in between the ribs. So those muscles are relaxed. When we inhale, the diaphragm will contract. It will pull the diaphragm downward, which creates more space in the thoracic cavity. The intercostal muscles contract, and that elevates the chest because the muscles become shorter, so the ribs kind of pull out. And so that elevates the chest and increases the volume of the chest. And remember, with the water hose example, when we put our thumb over it and we decrease the area that the water could flow, pressure increased. And so since we're increasing the area inside the chest cavity, the pressure will do the opposite. It will lower. And remember, pressure or air will move from a high to low pressure. And so when you inhale, if that pressure lowers in the lungs, then it's going to move from the atmosphere into our body. So it pulls in the air. Now the opposite happens during exhalation, where your muscles relax. So the diaphragm relaxes, it goes back to kind of its dome shape, whereas when it contracts, it goes from that dome shape to a more flattened state. The intercostal muscles relax, causing the chest to lower, and then that increases the pressure in the chest because the volume in the chest is now decreased. So there's less volume, so pressure increases. And then that leads to the expulsion of air out of the body because now the pressure is higher inside the lungs than it is compared to the external environment. So the air moves out. So we have a figure that just kind of shows this. Right, so you have your relaxed state. You have inspiration, where your diaphragm, right, see, relax, that diaphragm is kind of curved. When it contracts, it moves down, and then the chest expands. So that increases the volume of the lungs. Air flows in due to lower pressure. When your diaphragm relaxes, your intercostal muscles relax, lung volume decreases, and that causes air to flow out. And so if we would label the pressures, it would be high on the outside, low in the lungs during inspiration, and it will be high, low during expiration. Okay. Now, we can actually measure how much air is in our lungs during kind of different phases of breathing. So we can measure what's called the tidal volume, which is the volume of air that you inhale and exhale in a single breath. This is under normal breathing conditions, not like if you're taking a deep breath or if you're pushing a lot of air out. This is just like your resting breathing, single breath. So this is how much volume, the volume of air that you take in and push out during that relaxed state. Now, there's also this term called dead space volume. And this basically refers to the air that doesn't participate in gas exchange. So there's air that actually remains in our airways whenever we're exhaling and inhaling. So our body is not getting rid of all of the air that's in our lungs. There's always some residual air left over, and that's the dead space volume. Then we can classify the vital capacity. This is the maximum volume of air that you can hold in your lungs when you exhale after a maximum inhalation. So this is taking a deep breath and then exhaling as much as you can. And so this is classified as your vital capacity. And we've got a figure to help break these definitions and terms down, so hopefully you can understand them a little better. Now, we also have terms called the inspiratory reserve. So remember, we said your tidal volume is your normal breaths. Right? That's the amount of air that moves as you normally breathe and exhale. The inspiratory reserve is the air that you hold in your lungs past that tidal volume when you take a maximum inhalation. The expiratory reserve is the amount of air past the air that you exhale for your tidal volume when you do a forceful exhale. Okay? And then the residual volume is basically your dead space capacity. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. And so the residual volume is after the amount of air left over after that forceful expiration. Okay, so after you blow all the air you can out of your lungs, there's still going to be some air remaining, and that's a residual volume. And we can measure these volumes using a spirometer. Okay? So this is what one version of a spirometer looks like. We actually have a water-based spirometer that we would have used in lab if we were in face-to-face. And you breathe in and out of this to get your tidal volume. Okay, so what we're going to focus on here is this green line for now. Now notice with your tidal volume, which is those normal inhalation and exhalation, your air fluctuates a tiny bit. Right? So a normal person is going to have a tidal volume between 2,500 and say 3,000 based off of this graph. So when you do your tidal exhalation, so your normal exhalation, you'll generally have about 2,500 milliliters of air in your lungs. Whenever you do your tidal inhalation, you'll have about 3,000 milliliters of air in your lungs. Okay, so that's your tidal volume. Now your inspiratory reserve is whenever you take a maximum breath, so a deep breath is how much your lungs can hold past that tidal volume. So let's say you take a deep breath and you get to 6,000, right? So your tidal volume was 3,000, and then your deep breath was 6,000, so your inspiratory reserve is 3,000 milliliters. Okay. Same thing for your expiratory reserve, right? So you would say 2,500. This looks like 12 or so. Let's just say 15 for easy math, right? And so when you exhale, you go from 2,500 to 1,500 milliliters in your lungs. And so your expiratory reserve is about 1K. And then after you get all of that out, you have 1,500 left in. So your residual volume is 1,500. Okay. But then your vital capacity, right? So remember, with vital capacity is the maximum volume that can be exhaled after maximum inhalation. So your vital capacity is the sum of expiratory reserve, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve. So it's basically 6,000 minus 1,500. And so we're looking at a vital capacity of about 4,500. And so that's how we can kind of figure out, using a spirometer, what the lung capacity is of an individual. Now, this curve also has somebody with emphysema, and notice that the vital capacity goes down, as well as the inspiratory reserve, the expiratory reserve. You're not, it's hard to recover after you take a deep breath. So notice how this recovery rate is much longer compared to a normal person who recovers quite quickly. And so it's just kind of showing how that affects your vital capacity. All right, and so the last thing we're going to mention with this video is the gas exchange and transport of the air, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, and how it moves in and out of the bloodstream. Okay, so now looking at how gases actually diffuse from the alveoli to the blood to the alveoli, and then the same thing at the capillary cell level around the body. And like I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at this is all based off of the partial pressure gradient. And this partial pressure gradient establishes a gradient that the gases will follow, and they'll move from their high partial pressures to their low partial pressures. Right? So they always go down their partial pressure gradient, right? So from high to low. And now what we mean by partial pressure is just the pressure exerted by one gas in a mixture of gases, right? So if you have oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, etc., each of those gases have a partial pressure, and the partial pressure is proportional to its percentage in the total gas composition, right? So if you have oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, right? Let's say oxygen's 30%, carbon dioxide's 40%, and nitrogen's 30%, right? The partial pressure for oxygen is going to be proportional to that. So if you have, say, a system where, let's say, this is the partial pressure for each one, and then another system where, you know, oxygen's 20, carbon dioxide's 50, and nitrogen's 30, right? Nitrogen's not really going to move in a net direction because its gradient is equal. Carbon dioxide will move this way because it has a higher partial pressure on the right side than the left side. And oxygen's going to move from the left to the right because its partial pressure is higher on the left compared to the right. Okay? And so that's what we're looking at whenever we're learning and figuring out how these gases are diffusing into the blood and out of the blood and into the cells. Okay. Now, oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into the blood, and it moves down its partial pressure gradient. So there's a lot of oxygen in the alveoli and very little in the blood whenever the blood is at the lungs because it's deoxygenated, right? It's dropped off most of the oxygen at the rest of the body. Now, the opposite is for carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, and the CO2 partial pressure is just slightly higher in the blood compared to the alveoli, but still it's higher, so that means it's going to move down its partial pressure gradient. So oxygen, right, it's going from the alveoli to the blood, and then carbon dioxide is going from the blood to the alveoli in the lungs. Okay, and so this is external respiration, right? Remember, that is the exchange of gases with the alveoli in the bloodstream. Now, if we look at internal respiration, right, remember this is the exchange of gases with the blood and the internal or the body's tissues. So that's, you know, any type of cell, in tissue cell or organ or basically any other component of the body where the blood is dropping that oxygen off. The oxygen will diffuse down its partial pressure gradient from the capillaries to the interstitial fluid, then into the cells. So basically you have this situation where the blood, the interstitial fluid, and the cells for oxygen, I'm going to use arbitrary numbers here, but let's say the partial pressure gradient is like 100 to 70 to 30 for oxygen, right? So it's going to move from blood to interstitial fluid to cells. Now, the opposite is the case for carbon dioxide, where the cells would be higher, interstitial fluid, and then the blood. So carbon dioxide, right, is going to move in this direction. Okay? And so the O2 and CO2 flow again down their own pressure gradient, but they're flowing in opposite directions. And that's pretty much always the case with the circulatory system, because where you're dropping off blood, you're taking up carbon dioxide. And where you're dropping off carbon dioxide, you're generally taking up oxygen. Wait, I said dropping off blood first. You know what I mean. When you're dropping off oxygen, you're taking up carbon dioxide. And so here's an image of this internal and external respiration. So you have your external respiration here, where your carbon dioxide is going into the lungs oxygen's coming out and going into the blood. And again, that's based off of high to low partial pressure gradients. Okay? And then at the internal respiration, you have your carbon dioxide going from tissues to blood, and your oxygen going from blood to tissues, the cells in those tissues. And then this is showing the interstitial fluid surrounding the cells, right? And it's showing that, that's following that concentration gradient, right? Or that partial pressure gradient, leading to kind of the flow of those gas molecules. And now the way that these gas molecules are transported throughout the blood varies depending on which gas you're looking at. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be transported a little differently compared to one another. So for example, oxygen will be mostly transported in a hemoglobin molecule. So 98% of the oxygen molecules is bound to hemoglobin. And so you get this oxyhemoglobin molecule after that happens. So oxyhemoglobin is just an oxygen molecule bound to that hemoglobin, so the iron ion in that heme group, and that turns it into what's known as an oxyhemoglobin. And then you actually can have small percentage of oxygen dissolved in the plasma, right? Because it's a gas, it can dissolve in a liquid. And so you'll have about 2% of the oxygen in our blood in the form of dissolved oxygen in the plasma itself. But again, most of that oxygen is going to be bound to the hemoglobin itself. And here we have an image showing that relationship. So oxygen coming in from the alveolus, binding with that hemoglobin, making that oxyhemoglobin. And then you have that small percentage coming in and just kind of floating around in the plasma. This is a little different compared to carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide can be bound to hemoglobin, but only about 20% of carbon dioxide is stored in the hemoglobin molecule itself. 10% is dissolved in the plasma as carbon dioxide, but the large proportion of carbon dioxide, so about 70%, is going to be converted in the plasma as bicarbonate. Okay, and so this is the same kind of bicarbonate that we were looking at in earlier chapters. Okay, and we'll kind of show how that happens here in a second. So here we have the carbon dioxide being dissolved, carbon dioxide attaching to the hemoglobin, and then this is the majority of the way that carbon dioxide is transported. So as bicarbonate, that HCO3 minus molecule. Basically what happens, your carbon dioxide will enter and interact with the red blood cell. There's an enzyme there that will cause those molecules to bind with the water, carbon dioxide to bind with the water, so you get H2CO3. That carbonic acid, the H2CO3, will lose a hydrogen ion and turn into bicarbonate. And then that bicarbonate goes into the plasma, and that's where it's stored and transported mostly throughout the body. Okay? So a little bit more complex process here for the carbon dioxide, but it is transported in the blood, right, from the tissues to the lungs. Okay? All right, so that's it for our second video. We'll come back with our third video, and we'll finish up the discussion on the respiratory system, where we will talk about some diseases. We'll do kind of a review animation, and call it a day with this module. Okay, so with that, we'll see you in the next video.